A word about the book. The book consists of 3 sections. The first section is the poem, which is really the story of these children. The second section is the play. And the third section is an account of the journey of Kultar's Mime. I'm reading the last chapter of the third section. The title is Telling the Tale 30 Years Later, The Extraordinary Journey of Kultar's Mime, Part 8. What is it that I hope to find in these dusty alleys, forbidden, unkind? My own words, written more than 25 years ago, haunt me as Meher and I walk the narrow and filthy streets of Tilak Vihar, also known as the Widow Colony. The tale has been told 34 times already. They have all listened rapt, the mighty and the weak, the famous and the anonymous, scholars and illiterates, rich and poor, most with writing hearts and salty cheeks. Why? Because at the end of the day, this could be anyone's story. Many a time have they asked, did you go there? Did you meet them? Our answer until now has always been a shake of the head, followed by a torrent of words explaining why. We don't want to be disrespectful of the victims. We don't want to reopen their wounds. We don't want to exploit their pain, which is ever present, unending in any way. But the pull of Tilak Vihar is too strong. We can't stay away. And yet, I'm at a loss to find the right way to do it. Once again, Dr. Uma Chakrabarti comes to the rescue. A few weeks earlier, on the phone leading up to the second India tour of Kultar's Mime, Dr. Chakrabarti had said something that felt not unlike a stinging slap on my face. You Sikhs have abandoned the survivors of 1984, were her exact words, delivered in her trademark, straightforward manner. Flushed with the recent success of Kultar's Mime, I remember feeling a little indignant before acknowledging that as much as Kultar's Mime has helped restart the conversation about 1984, it was quite irrelevant to the survivors, who continue to scratch out a miserable existence in Tilak Vihar. Dr. Chakrabarti told a desolate tale of 3 generations. The first, devastated by the horrific violence, the second by drugs and alcohol, as hundreds of young men grew up with no authority figures or male role models in their lives, as their widowed, mostly illiterate mothers were singularly focused on providing for the tattered remnants of their families. The third generation, she said, was now in jeopardy, as nothing of note had been done in the 30 years that had passed since the carnage. She encouraged me to go to Tilak Vihar to see for myself, and she offered to introduce me to social workers and human rights activists who had won the survivors' trust by tirelessly working with them as they struggled to survive. This is how Meher and I end up walking the inhospitable and miserable streets of Tilak Vihar, and miserable they are, more miserable than I had ever imagined them to be. Everywhere are the unmistakable signs of poverty and neglect. Crumbling buildings, peeling paint, piles of refuse everywhere, narrow alleys piled with rubble. Our guide is Amar Nijhavan, a young Canadian woman and recent college graduate who has chosen to serve the survivors of Tilak Vihar, working with a non-profit called Aman Biradri. It's a busy day for Amar. The next day, a community center for the survivors is being inaugurated, and she has brought with her a young artist who will paint murals on the wall of the room that will serve as a library in the community center. We briefly look into the new library, which is a tiny room in a ground floor apartment, its walls painted in bright colors. We pass clusters of young girls with their hair in plaits. They break into shy smiles when they see Amar, and some of them run up to hug her. We climb several flights of stairs to enter a tiny apartment, which is Baby Kaur's world. Baby Kaur is a short, light-skinned woman, probably in her mid to early 40s. She greets us cordially and invites us to sit in her tiny parlor. Meher looks a little nonplussed when she is offered water, but I politely and somewhat embarrassedly decline on everyone's behalf. Amar briefly explains that we only drink bottled water as we are from, quote, abroad. Already uncomfortable at our imposition, I feel terrible having to refuse the water and suggesting to Baby Kaur that her water is not good enough for us to drink, but she takes it in stride and she doesn't appear offended. How do you talk to a survivor of something as horrible as 1984? You struggle for an opening as you try to find something meaningful to say, something compassionate, something humanizing, something that will not make your interest seem superficial or worse, voyeuristic. Somehow we stumble into those dark days 30 years ago, and Baby Kaur's narrative slowly emerges almost of its own accord. It is, of course, heart-wrenching. As horrifying as her recollections of 1984 is her story of the struggle to survive as a poor, neglected, orphaned teen, desperately trying to hold her family together as one set of vague promises of help and rehabilitation fades, yielding to others equally lacking in substance. The tears are lurking somewhere very close beneath her calm and cheerful exterior, and they emerge of their own accord as she relives the horrors of the last 30 years. As I commiserate with her, I want to share with her the love and compassion of thousands of strangers from all around the world who have wept upon embracing the stories of Baby Kaur and her siblings in sorrow. I find myself talking about the play and its journey in an attempt to convey some of that to her. And then very hesitatingly, I find myself asking if she, by any chance, knows a young man called Avtar, who would probably be in his mid-30s, who was deaf and mute, who had suffered the terrible pain of watching his father being lynched before his own eyes. I am dumbfounded when she says yes. I must confess that the thought has been in the back of my mind, but I'm not quite sure how to process the fact that this young man, who until this moment was a character in a story, is alive and present and indeed nearby. I am of course happy and yet at the same time inexplicably fearful. How will he take it when he hears that his pain has been shared with thousands of strangers? Will this knowledge rip the scabs off wounds that are not quite healed? For an instant, the Kultar's mind journey becomes an impossibly heavy burden that crushes me. But after a small silence, I ask if we can visit him. Baby Kaur explains that he lives nearby, but is most likely at work. He is one of the fortunate few in the colony who have a, quote, government job. We are terribly disappointed because we know we will not have time to return to Tilak Vihar. And on a whim, I asked Baby Kaur if we can visit his home at least, even if there's a very slim chance of finding him there. Baby Kaur and Seema Kaur, another survivor, lead our little procession through the alleyways of Tilak Vihar. We pass a small park, desolate and overrun with trash, where a ragtag band of little street urchins is gathered, looking at us with great curiosity. Hardly a unique sight in a poor Delhi neighborhood, with the exception that all the boys are sick. They wear ragged clothes, and most of them sport judas on their heads. A young Sikh in his mid-20s sits in their midst. As I walk up to the little band, all of them rise to their feet and greet me with shy smiles. These are the grandchildren of Tilak Vihar, the third generation of survivors. The young man tells me he's a volunteer who teaches the children Punjabi. As we walk through the trash-filled streets, I find many conflicting emotions coursing through me. There is nothing in Tilak Vihar to feel good about. It is a sad, miserable place suffused with the pain of the survivors, whose palpable grief hangs like a pall upon its shattered neighborhoods. The shy smiles of the young children who greet us are a testimonial to the resiliency of human life. But I cannot help despairing at the bleak existence that almost inevitably seems to be their future, bereft that they are of resources and support, 30 years after the unspeakable calamity that turned the lives of their families upside down. And yet, as I look into the eyes of the young Punjabi teacher, I see not despair, but a quiet determination. Amar Nijavan walks ahead of me, her shoulders straight, unbowed by the burden that she has chosen to carry willingly and cheerfully. After walking for what seems like forever, assailed by the misery of Tilak Vihar, we climb a narrow flight of stairs to an apartment block that is indistinguishable from its neighbors. We are at Kultar's apartment, and a heavy lock swings from the door. Deeply disappointed, we head back to the street, but the ever-resourceful baby corps who has decided to knock on neighboring doors excitedly beckons, asking us to return. In the landing stands a young woman carrying an infant, an older child in tow, looking somewhat suspiciously at our little group. Seema Kaur talks to her rapidly in a language that sounds quite unfamiliar, and she opens the door, inviting us into her parlor, which is as tiny as baby Kaur's. All of us squeeze in, accompanied by a few curious neighbors and an assortment of children. The woman's name is Gurmeet Kaur. She is from Rajasthan and is of Sindhi origin. She has been married to Kultar for 8 years. She pulls out a smartphone and starts texting. A few minutes later, a very handsome young man in his mid-30s stands at the door. Perhaps a bit nonplussed at the sight of so many strangers crowded into his little parlor. Everyone starts talking all at once, and I learn about the journey of the child who used his little body to tell the heartbreaking tale of his father's brutal murder. Like many other survivors of Trilokpuri and other trans-Yamuna neighborhoods where the worst carnage took place, the shattered remnants of Avtar's family were brought to Tilak Vihar to be, quote, resettled. Each family was given a tiny one-room apartment and was promised a coveted government job which would give them some form of subsistence. Avtar was one of the lucky ones, as his mother was given a job at the Tihar prison in Delhi. It was probably a miracle wrought by the character of his late mother that this young boy who suffered such unspeakable trauma in 1984 grew up in Tilak Vihar, avoiding the ever-present lure of drugs and alcohol, as most of his peers succumbed to. As I learn of the impossible story of how Avtar survived and thrived, I feel the burden lifting. This young man, against all odds, living in the desolate confines of Tilak Vihar, has impossibly carved out a life for himself. A life that includes a wife who is purely proud of his accomplishments, 2 beautiful children, a job, and a home. It is also remarkable that through all this, he has stayed connected to his faith and his identity. The faith of the Sikhs of Delhi has been tested many times. As I look at this proud young Sikh in his impeccably wound turban, my thoughts drift back to the time, almost 350 years ago, when the Sikhs of Delhi were devastated by the execution of Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib, the 9th Sikh Guru. The Guru's body and severed head lying unclaimed in Chandni Chowk, one of Delhi's best-known streets, I am sure must have forced many Sikhs to re-examine their personal commitment to their faith and its consequences. In the dark days of 1984, many Sikhs in Delhi were similarly forced to reflect upon the implications of being a Sikh. It is impossible for me to put myself in the shoes of someone who saw their entire life go up in flames, and it is absolutely unconscionable to judge any Sikh who made the difficult choice of effacing his very visible identity in the face of such savagery. It is a well-known fact that many did. Yet, I cannot help but feel tremendous admiration for this young man who could have slipped into despair, who could have sought the embrace of drugs or alcohol to blunt his pain, as many of his peers did, who could have shed his identity, which had brought him and his family so much suffering. But he didn't. The story of Kultar's survival is almost miraculous in itself. The story of his surviving and thriving with his identity intact is heroic. It is a slap on the face of every bigot and every tyrant who has attempted to do harm to someone else, driven by pure hatred. For Kultar is not alone. Just as he has survived and thrived, there are millions all over the world who continue to rise, phoenix-like from the ashes of destruction wrought by hatred, affirming with their resilience that no matter how difficult the circumstances the human spirit will endure, this is what gives me hope, no matter how many fires continue to burn all over the world. Gurmeet Kaur, Kultar's wife, has an animated conversation in sign language with her husband. She is telling him about our journey, where his story has been told, and the countless strangers who send him their love and goodwill. He glances at me and Meher several times, nodding, and when she is done, he reaches for a pen and scribbles on his hand. His outstretched palm, which he holds up for us to see, simply says, "Thank you."